welcome back to another how-to with me, Teacup Jojo. Lovely to have you joining me today. If you haven't got one already, go grab yourself a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, glass of wine. You will not be needing your hooks and yarn today, so you can just sit back, drink your drink and follow along. Today we are looking at patterns, the written pattern. In the last couple of tutorials we have looked at the charts and how to follow the charts along. Today we are looking at the written patterns. I know some of you have been asking about that. It's sometimes a bit difficult and tricky to follow along and know exactly what stitches you're being asked to do or where to do them, so hopefully I will help you through that today, and we'll finish by knowing a bit more about patterns, which will be good. So as I said, you don't need your hooks and yarn today. You just need to sit back and hopefully learn something. When you're first looking at a pattern, some of our earliest square patterns like these two, they don't have all the information on that we have now in our later squares. If you look here, it tells you the name and the number. That's great, but it doesn't, and it gives you the stitches. This one tells you the abbreviations, and so does this one. I apologize for this messy part here. This one actually gives you some of the directions of how to make those stitches, because this one was, like I said, one of our earlier squares, so it's quite nice to have those instructions there. As we've gone through different squares in the CAL, we have put stitch glossaries at the end of the pattern, so if a new stitch comes up, we have been explaining it on the last page of how to do that stitch. So we don't explain every stitch, every pattern, but there's always plenty of places you can look for those, or just ask us. You know, we're quite happy to answer your questions and comments, so ask below in the comment section, or come into the group and ask us there how to do it. It's absolutely fine, and obviously lots of help on the net too. So on a pattern, on the later ones, we do have the basic information that we try and put on every pattern now, and that is if we've taken a pattern from somewhere, we usually will acknowledge where it's from. Now this, I think, was an early printout from our admin page, and it didn't have the where it was adapted from, but this is on the more recent file that's in the group. What you'll find is we put on each square now the level. You might see that a lot are intermediate, but that doesn't mean that if you've only been crocheting for a couple of months, it doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means it might be a little bit more tricky. There might be some things that you're not quite familiar with doing, but by all means, you know, have a look at the pattern, have a look at the chart, come and watch the video on YouTube and have a go. People have really been surprising themselves, and I'm overwhelmed by how well people have been doing, and people have been really surprising themselves. So have a look at that, and some of them will say, I don't think these ones do, but some patterns will say beginner, or it might be beginner, intermediate. So then it tells you the yarn weight, and you will see on all of our squares we are using exactly the same yarn. And then when it says hook, generally all the squares will be will tell you about using the same hook size, because it makes your squares consistent. All these squares should come up at around 6 inches, 15 centimeters, so just to keep it consistent. But occasionally a pattern might be a bit bigger, so we might suggest to go down a hook size to make that, you know, just to make it fit. But we do also say whatever size you've already been using. So if you need to use a bigger size hook because you've quite tight crocheter, then just stick with what you've been using. Or if you need to use a smaller hook because you crochet quite loosely and your squares are coming up bigger, then do that. But this says approximately 6 inches. Now that's a guide. If your squares are coming up at 8 inches, 7 inches, 5 inches, that's fine. If you're happy with that, then that's absolutely fine. This is usually a guide, okay, for an average tension on that hook. So then also here you've got colour, and it says the number of colours. Now this one, as I've just told you, I think this must have been one of the first versions of this pattern, and I'm sorry that I didn't get the correct one. I think I thought I was printing the correct one, but brain fade. And this one here, it says anything you want, so it's basically means it's a 1 colour square, or you can change colour as often as you like. This one here says colour change indicated in pattern, so I don't think this one actually has got colour change as such, but some of them do have colour changes, like this one, Daisy, in the corner, does suggest pattern colour changes. And obviously the Sunburst is good with the colour changes. But people have had great success with using even these kind of patterns and doing just 1 colour. It's quite amazing how 1 colour can look. So that's your basic guide of what you will be doing and needing. And we always put on here US crochet stitch terminology used, because just to remind, if this might be the first pattern that you've come across from our group, you won't necessarily know that we've started on that. And I'm telling you how to read patterns for our group, but you know, this is going to be universal. You can take it to reading other patterns, which is why I'm going to show you. This is kind of how we lay out our patterns. We try and do it in a bullet format, so you can just follow it down step by step. But traditionally, a lot of patterns are written a bit like this, where you've got it written in paragraph form. So you've got paragraph form there, and here you've got paragraph form. And I think this one might be the same. Yeah, you've got paragraph form here as well. So I'm going to show you the 2 different ways. This is more of a traditional way of having your patterns written. This is yeah, more of a traditional way of patterns. So we have gone along the route of laying them out like this in bullet form, just to make it that bit more simple, a bit more easy to understand. You can see the bullet format here. Okay, it just makes it that little bit more easy to follow along. You can kind of mark off the points that you've done, which is where your highlighters and coloured pens come in handy. You can just tick off when you've done a part, if that helps you. Okay, whereas when it's in the paragraph, it's not always as easy to mark off particular parts, but that's probably more so when you will want to mark parts off, so you can follow it a bit more easily. Okay, so let's actually look at one of these patterns in more detail. Well, before we look at one pattern in detail, let me just tell you the first thing you'll notice in a pattern is it tells you here block pattern. So this is where we actually start the block, the square. And if you look here, it says chain 12 and slip stitch into the first chain. Okay, and this one here says chain 25. Now, unless we're going to have a very big circle in the middle of our square, you will know from this that chaining 25 will mean you're going to work in a row rather than a round. Whereas if you look at this, chain 12 and slip stitch into the first chain, that indicates it's going to be in the round, even if there wasn't a photo. This one's got photo. Most of our patterns have step-by-step photos. This one here hasn't, because it's not the right pattern. It's not the final edit, so it hasn't got photos. So if you had a pattern that hadn't got photos, you would look at this and you would know from chain 25 that that was working in a row, and this one, it's going to be in the ring. And it actually says here 3 double crochet into ring, and I think this one here says I prefer to start with a magic circle, but if you'd rather start with a chain 5 and join with a slip stitch. And this is what we try and tell you a lot, that you don't have to use the magic circle. Some of you don't get on very well with it, but I think in tutorial number 3 or 4 I showed you the magic circle, how to do that, and how to do alternatives like the chain 5 and slip stitch, and I showed you a different version as well. So you'll know that that's in the round, even if these pictures weren't here. Okay, so let's have a look at one of these patterns in a bit more detail. Okay, so we're going to start with the sunburst square. It's one of our earlier squares, number 4, so we're going to start with that one. And as I said before, it doesn't give you all the details of, you know, the yarn and the hook and all of that, and it does give you the full details of how to do all the stitches. Normally you would just see the abbreviation of what the stitches are on the pattern. Okay, so pattern says for round 1 start with a magic circle, but if you'd rather start with a chain 5 and join with a slip stitch. Okay, so that's quite straightforward, you just follow that. Next, chain 3 to count as the first double crochet and work 15 more double crochet stitches into the ring. So I would suggest, if you are following a pattern, that you read it first. I didn't say this on the chart videos, but I would suggest that you look at the chart first and you have a look and work out what you're going to do. So especially with a written pattern, I suggest you read it through first. And then what I would do is I would underline or circle chain 3. And I don't know if you can see that colour on video. Let me see if I can just zoom in slightly. There we go. So I would circle or highlight chain 3, which counts as the first double. So that's when you do your chain coming up from your ring. And then it says, and then work 15 more double crochet stitches into the ring. Now this is actually using the whole word of the stitch rather than just abbreviating to a DC. Okay, so and work 15 more double crochet stitches into the ring. That's quite straightforward. Join with a slip stitch to the top of the beginning chain 3. Now you will see that in so many patterns that work in the round, whether it's a double crochet. If it's a double crochet, it will nearly always be in the top of the chain 3. If it's single crochets, it will be in the top of the single crochet. So yeah, so join with a slip stitch to the beginning chain 3. Now when you're becoming familiar with patterns and crocheting, don't always assume that your slip stitch is into your top chain, because there might be a variation to it where it wants you to kind of skip over or go behind or whatever. So don't always assume that it is definitely to the top chain. Okay, and then it tells you here 16 in brackets here, it says 16 double crochet stitches in total. So that's just reminding you how many stitches you should have at the end of that round. So you can just highlight, underline that. So when you've finished, you can look at your square and you can go around and count them before you do your slip stitch. Count them before you do your slip stitch, because otherwise you'll have to undo that slip stitch and they're not very easy to undo necessarily. So count them, and if you've got the right amount, including that chain, remember, then you will do your slip stitch and close that up. So round 1, quite nice and simple, and then it just says to fasten off. Okay, so moving on to round 2, it says attach the next colour with a slip stitch to any double crochet. So I would highlight this bit that says slip stitch to any double crochet. Oops, that's a bit of a funny circle. Slip stitch to any double crochet. Okay, so that means you are taking your hook into the top of your stitch, and then you're going to do your you're going to just join a colour in the top of that stitch. That's quite simple. Okay, now as I said before on the chart videos, I'm not showing you how to do a particular square today. I'm just talking you through like the chart, or now talking you through the pattern. So I'm not actually, if you're thinking, well, she didn't really show me how to make that square in the end, well, no, that's not the intention today. If you want to watch a video on how this square was made, then look back in the playlist and find square number 4, and there is a video tutorial there for this very square. Okay, and you can get the pattern for it from the files in the group on Facebook as well. So slip stitch any colour, so colour with a slip stitch to any double crochet. So we have got some abbreviations going on now. So then chain 1, then do a puff stitch in the same stitch. So this means that you would do your double crochet, you would attach your new colour in here, and then you do a chain 1. So you would chain 1 above your stitch, and then it says do a puff stitch in the same stitch. So if you don't know what a puff stitch is, and puff stitches can vary from pattern to pattern as to how many yarn overs you do, how many stitches. So you would look back here at the beginning and it tells you puff stitch here. Okay, it gives you the description for the puff stitch here. So you would follow what it says here: yarn over, insert your hook in the indicated stitch, draw the yarn through the stitch, and then it says 3 times. So 7 loops on the hook. So what happens is, now this has got some asterisks here. If you can see, I've gone over it a bit there, but there's an asterisk there and there's one here. So what you would do, if you ever see these, it says 3 times. So you do that 3 times. So you yarn over, insert your hook, and then you draw some yarn through, and you do that 3 times until you have 7 loops on the hook. Okay, and then you pull, that says yarn over, and pull through all loops on the hook, chain 1 to lock it. So I would highlight this 7 loops on the hook, so you know you're working until you have 7 loops on the hook, and then afterwards you do a chain 1. Okay, so when it says here to do a puff stitch in the same stitch, so you do a chain 1 and then you do a puff stitch into here, and then it says and in each DC around, so that means in the top of each of these double crochets you would do a puff stitch. Okay, so you would do that chain 1, and then you do your puff stitch, and then you will chain 1. Okay, it tells you chain 1, puff stitch in the same stitch and in every double crochet around. So you're going to do a chain 1 in between each of these stitches. So you can see under there there's a chain in between each of these puff stitches. Okay, so then it says join with a slip stitch to the first puff stitch, and 16 puff stitches in total. Okay, so let's do that in the blue. That's how many we have at the end of the round. So puff stitch in each double crochet. Okay, so that's how you follow that, and then join with a slip stitch to the first puff stitch, so in the top of this first puff stitch that you've done, and that would be your round 2. So for round 3 it says attach next cut. Oh, I'm out off of camera, sorry about that, people. There we go, there we go. Are we in? There we go. So round 3, attach next colour with a slip stitch in the chain 1 space of any puff stitch. So this is because you did a chain 1 after each puff stitch, you will join your new yarn in one of these spaces. Okay, so one of these spaces here you join your new yarn in, not in the actual stitch. Okay, so slip stitch in the chain 1 space. Okay, and then it tells you to chain 2, so chain 2, and then we've got brackets here. Okay, so this reminds you that it's a repeat. We had the asterisks in the description before, but here we've got brackets. So this is reminding you this either, let me do it in blue so you can see a bit better, either brackets or asterisk asterisks indicate a repeat. Okay, so it says here chain 2, then cluster stitch and chain 2, and then it says in the same space and in each chain 1 spaces around. Join with a slip stitch to the beginning cluster stitch, and then here it says 16 cluster stitches in total. Now on the previous round it was 16 cluster stitches. So when you first read this, it could sound a bit like you've got to do a cluster stitch and a chain 2 in the same space, and also in each chain 1 space. But if, as I said, the previous round it told us was 16 puff stitches. Okay, so this was our puff stitches here, the orange ones. That was 16. So if you did a cluster stitch in each space, and chain 1 spaces, if you kind of read that you had to do it in 2 places, then you would end up with 32. So that's why it's good to read it first, just in case you misinterpret what it's actually telling you. So this is telling you that you start with your new colour in one of these spaces, and then you're going to chain 2, and then you're going to do a cluster stitch. And again, look at your instructions here, and it tells you how to do a cluster stitch. And again, it's using these asterisks, I can't say that word, can I, to tell you what to do and how many times to do it. Okay, and again, it tells you how many loops will be on your hook before you yarn over and pull through. So you will follow that and make your cluster stitch. So you'll make your cluster stitch, and then you will chain 2, and then it says you're doing that in the space, so you're doing that where you joined, you're doing your chain 2 and your cluster stitch, and then you're doing it in each chain. I'm off the camera again, I'm really sorry guys. Doing it in each chain 1 space around. So you've done your first one in here, and then you do your chain 2, and then you're going to do a cluster stitch in this next chain space, and then you're going to do your chain 2. So this is making more spaces ready for the next round. Okay, and then when you're done, so you're doing it, so what I would do is I would highlight this cluster stitch, chain 2 in each chain 1 space. Okay, I would highlight or underline that part so I remember that and don't get confused. And then, as before, I would underline 16 cluster stitches, and then it says to fasten off. So you would fasten off that colour and go on to your next colour. Okay, now I quite like this. I quite like how this pattern is written, because it says to start round 4, attach your next colour with a slip stitch to any chain 2 space. So in a chain 2 space, so that would be one of these gaps, okay, between your cluster stitches, your chain 2 space. And then it says chain 4 to count as the first treble. So that will happen often. You'll either have to count chain 2, 3, 4 to count as your stitch. Okay, just brings it up to the height that you need. So chain 4 to count as the first treble stitch, and then crochet 2 treble stitches in the same space. So you've joined into your chain 2 space, and you have done your chain and 2 treble stitches. And then this is the bit that I like. It says, now the steps might sound a bit tricky, but it's not as bad as it seems. I love it. You're basically going to turn your sunburst round into squares. In the picture below, you can see which stitches you'll use for the straight lines, which are the pink and the corners are blue. So someone has done a really great picture here that's showing you these pink stitches for the sides, and it's showing you these blue stitches for the corners, which I think is so helpful. I love it. Love it. I've missed a side there. I love it. I think it's so helpful, and we do try and be quite helpful on our patterns, but we don't always get this going on. But we do have our charts now, so the charts are quite useful. So it tells you that, okay, and then it tells you first crochet 3 double crochet in the next chain space. So you would do your 3 double crochet in the next space to where you've worked. So this would have been your first one. It depends where you start. I obviously started in one of these spaces, so you'll do your 3 double crochet in the next chain space, 3 half double crochet in the next chain space, and 3 double crochet in the next chain space. So you're basically making this into a square. Okay, so oh, I know what I did here. I was just looking at this thinking I'm really confused. I know what I did. I think this is the one where I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, this is one of these where I made a mistake. Okay, I did 15 clusters. Made a bit of a boo-boo. So this side looks a bit different because what I've done is I've done my third cluster, or third set of 3 in this same space. So I was a bit confused what's going on there, so I'm going to turn this around. We're going to look at it the proper way. Okay, so I would have joined in a 2 chain space, so it would have been here, and then I would have done my initial trebles, and then double crochets, half double crochets, double crochets, and followed it along. And you're basically just following these instructions along as you did before. You've got these asterisks going on here, and it says you've now made one of the 4 straight lines of your square. Okay, and it tells you you're doing it in the next chain 2 space, then you're doing 3, so 3 double crochet, and then you're doing 3 half double crochet, 3 double crochet in the next chain 2 space. So it says you've now made one of your 4 straight lines of your square, which is this here. Okay, and then it says next you'll make your first corner, all in the next chain 2 space. So again, so you don't get confused as to where it would be, it's all in the next chain 2 space. Okay, so it says crochet 3 treble stitches, then chain 3 and make another 3 treble stitches. So it shows you here 3 treble, chain 3, 3 treble. Okay, so you can either follow this or you could follow this, but we are talking about the written pattern, so obviously we're talking about following this here. So it says repeat this sequence to make your straight line and corner 2 more times, and then repeat from the asterisk to the asterisk to make a straight line once more. But sometimes we can get hung up on what these words say, and we think, oh my gosh, what does that mean? Oh, I can't follow that. How many times? What? But the good thing is, if you take it step by step, forget that this is here. That doesn't exist because it doesn't always exist in patterns. You've just got this part here. Okay, so you would first do your 3 double crochet in the next chain 2 space, and what I try and do is I try and say it to myself in my head, and I try and cut out the words that I don't need. Obviously we need to write all this in a pattern, but in my head I try and cut out all the words that I don't need. So you probably hear me say it on my videos. I'll say 3 double, 3 half double. Actually, sometimes I just say half. So it'll just be 3 double, 3 half, 3 double. I know they're all into a space. Okay, I know they all go into one of these spaces. Okay, so I don't need to tell myself that. Just 3 double, 3 half, 3 double, corner. And once I've done a corner once, I usually remember it. So corner, I can tell myself 3 treble, 3 chain, 3 treble, 3 treble, 3 chain, 3 treble, Okay, and then I just repeat that to myself as I go around. And even though this says about repeat this sequence, straight line, corner 2 more times, then repeat from here to here, and then finish your last corner and do this, do this, do this, I know if I can remember these things in my head. So I'm saying to myself, let me get my blue pen. So I'm saying to myself, 3 double, 3 half, 3 double, and then I say to myself corner, and I know it's 3 treble, 3 chain, 3 treble, and I know that's what I've got to do all the way around until I get back to the beginning. And then I just look here as what it says for the beginning to fasten off, and it says to finish your last corner, crochet, where are we, chain 3 and join with a slip stitch to the top of the beginning chain 4. So I would skip all of this and look to where it says I join my last slip stitch. Okay, but I do try and cut out all of this blurb in the middle here, the necessary blurb, but I try and cut all that out by just taking it down to 3 double, 3 half, 3 double, then my corner, 3 treble, 3 chain, 3 treble, and that helps me remember it so much more easily than thinking chain 2 in the next chain 2 space, blah 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 blah. So try it that way, guys. You will hear me say that on videos. I do tend to abbreviate these stitches sometimes. So yeah, so that's round 4. So you would finish off around here, fasten off, do your slip stitch, and it would be time for doing round 5.